Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and we're going to Disneyland. I almost nailed it. All right, so our trip to Disneyland, of course, doesn't start in Southern California, because why? Why would it start in Southern California? It starts here in England, right? Of course it does, right on the outskirts of Sherwood Forest. Right? And it starts with a continuation of the name game, right? We talked about how closely connected the Byrons and the Poes were. And by the time that Bewley's talking about here, in the mid-1600s, there's plenty of reason to believe that the Byrons and the Poes knew each other going back 200 years or further. Who knows how closely related the families remained thereafter. So we know the importance of the Byrons and their connection to the Romantic movement, and could it be a coincidence that the newly created poetic mythology of like Robin Hood was really created by the Byrons and the Poes back in the late 1400s and early 1500s? And how that mythology and its format, the way it was presented and everything, continues to be used as a mild form of social control today. So now furthering this concept, right, and looking at a possible orchestration. So Bewley, in his research, finds entries of marriages in a large number of Nottinghamshire parish registers have been published, right? And among them, he lists these here, right? They got a couple Poes. The last one he lists here, John Hutcheson and Francis Poe. And so when I saw those names together, I immediately thought of this guy, Francis Hutcheson. And Francis Hutcheson, right, he was the Ulster-born philosopher, right, to a family of Scottish Presbyterians, R.E. Covenanters, right? And he became one of the founding fathers of the Scottish Enlightenment. And check out his dates here. He's got 88s on his birthday and his death day. Right? And the Scottish Enlightenment, of which he was a leading figure, was the period between the 18th and early 19th century Scotland, characterized by an outpouring of intellectual and scientific accomplishments. Among the fields that rapidly advanced were philosophy, political economy, engineering, architecture, medicine, geology, archaeology, botany, and zoology, law, agriculture, chemistry, and sociology. All of those things come out of the Scottish Enlightenment, but that's not all. Francis Hutcheson was a major influence on the founding fathers, right? This Norman Fearing, whoever he was, very specialist in intellectual history of the colonial New England. He describes Francis Hutcheson as probably the most influential and respected moral philosopher in America in the 18th century. Right? So it's his ideas that the founding fathers are really adopting, and he got his ideas from the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. Right? From Sussex. It's just unbelievable. But seeing that Bewley dedicates his book to this William Hutcheson Poe, and Francis Hutcheson comes from Ulster, the Poes are all over Ulster. He's a Hutcheson Poe. I gotta believe they're related. And again, another underscore for that idea that the Poe is a hidden royal bloodline involved in all of these machinations. All right, so now he talks about these entries being interesting in that it shows the Poes being pronounced as a dissyllable, as it's pronounced today in Ireland, I guess, right? But he also finds these marriages at St. Mary's, Nottingham. Wait, where is it? It says, on July 21st, 1661, William Disney and Sarah Poy, which he obviously believes to be Poe. And when I saw that, I was like, come on, you gotta be kidding me. Disney? Walt? I can connect Walt Disney to Edgar Allan Poe now. Could they be related, Right, I can get George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette through his father, following that back to the Scottish Covenanters, right, through Alexander Payton, the Masked Man, and the immortal David Poe, the Scottish Covenanter, to Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest, to the Knights Templar, to the Cathars, right, and the Merovingian Jesus bloodline, also to Jerome Powell, who's sitting as the 16th chair of the Federal Reserve, and President-elect Joe Biden. I can now connect Mortimer Mouse, right? Mickey, Steamboat Willie. That is just too unbelievable, right? And before I get too off track, I want to talk just quickly about Steamboat Willie, right? Mortimer. Right? He's especially notable for being the first Disney cartoon with synchronized sound, as well as the first cartoon to feature a fully post-produced soundtrack. Disney understood from early on that synchronized sound was the future of film. Of course he did. Right, so now I'm thinking this is just too unbelievable, right? Could it be that Walt Disney and Edgar Allan Poe share a bloodline? And so I went looking for this William Disney through my Genie page and tracking this Disney line, and I could not connect Walt Disney to this William Disney and Sarah Poe. Right? But what I could do was connect the Disneys to all over this region right, of England, right, which was the Lincolnshire region, directly connected to Papelwick and by extension Sherwood Forest, which would be here. The Disneys are all over this land for a millennia. Right? This is Disneyland. Right? So undaunted, well, what could I find if I followed Walt Disney's name back? Right? And they throw a roadblock up right away. Right? Here he is, right, born December 5th, 1901, right, in Cook County, Illinois. You know, the numerology is really interesting. Take a look at that, right? Right, but they throw a roadblock up, right? Immediate family, son of Private and Flora Disney. And I think it's no coincidence that his mother's name was Flora, you know, given where this is going to go. Right? So I was like, you know, well, you're not going to stump me that fast, right? And of course, a simple Google search, you know, reveals Elias Disney here, and Elias meaning son of Yahweh in its Hebrew translation, right? He was born in Canada, and his parents were Keppel Elias Disney and Mary Richardson. And that's interesting also, kind of seeing where this plays out, right? So again, really ineffectual, because when you do a search for Keppel Elias Disney, he has a Genie page, right? Right? Father of Private. So really, what the heck is the purpose of that roadblock, right? Right? And then once again, the way these things work, I get mugged, right? Because Keppel is the son of Arundel Elias Disney. Are you kidding me with Arundel? And it's, oh my God, and its association with Maryland and going back to the royal courts and to the crown and all of this, that is unbelievable. Walt Disney's great-grandfather's first name was Arundel? And so now I'm like, oh my God, now Disney's like tying into the whole Baltimore. Did not anticipate this coming, you know, especially the way that all of this ties together, because I get to have a really fun round of trace the paternal family line of Walt Disney. All right, so now from Keppel, I get to bounce it back 30 times. Now, if you include Private and Walt, that's 32. So a nice little bit of numerology on this one. Right? Right, but there are a couple of interesting names that I want to bring up as we go. Right? I'm going to jump ahead a bit here. All right, so sitting at the number 9 spot going back, we have Sir Henry Disney here, right? And the years on him, 1569 to 1641. So he would be a knight of the late Tudors, early Stuarts dynasty. Okay, so now 12th back on the list is this William Disney, right? Circa 1475 to 1540, right? Norton Disney, Lincolnshire. Right, so Norton Disney was a township inside Lincolnshire, you know, Disney's own little town, right? And right, what I found out through a little digging is that this William Disney was the High Sheriff of Lincolnshire. From this same period we're talking about, that Byron and Poe would have been the underkeepers of Sherwood Forest. Right? And Lincolnshire is right there next to Papelwick and Sherwood Forest. There's no way that these families didn't know each other. Right? And we're talking about for generations of knowing each other, because these are family titles. And this is also that time, you know, late 1400s, early 1500s, conveniently enough, that all of this romantic storytelling and poetry is really coming out. You know, in some of the earliest surviving copies of certain poems, which they say were around for hundreds of years beforehand, just happened to start at this time. You know, could these families have been cooking these books and building these stories as again, as part of an agenda? Some long-term, and I mean really long-term game. You know, the long con. Okay? And again, depending on what the true timeline could be, maybe even not. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be centuries long. Right? And he's not alone in being a High Sheriff of Lincolnshire. The Sheriff of Lincolnshire is an annual thing. Like every year, somebody new is appointed sheriff, which is kind of interesting. You know, I guess that's one way to combat corruption or abuse of power. Right? So he's High Sheriff in 1532, I found out. All right? But he's not alone, right? You know, going all the way back to 1340, 41, there's a Wilhelmus. All right, so he's a 12, right? At 14, we have a John Disney circa 1425, and he's actually born in Nottinghamshire. So again, I just wanted to point him out to connect. You know, the Poes are there, and the Byrons are there, in Nottinghamshire. But now at 16 is where this Disney story starts to get really crazy. All right, so sitting pretty at the number 16 spot, right, is Sir William Disney V. 16 on my way to 30 is the end. Right, so just a little bit over the halfway point, or he would be the halfway point if I can include Walt and his father in this. All right, so what begins here is really amazing, right? And that is we have a long run of knights, right? And we're going backwards in time now. So this is, they say his estimated birth date was any time in the latter half of the 1300s, right? Or the 14th century. You know, as we bring this thing back, because we have a long way to go, you know, what a knight is becomes more and more important. The responsibilities of the knight, the wealth of the knight, the land holdings, their proximity to royalty. This starts to go way back. Right? We have 5 generations here. Right? And so in verifying what's about to come, I realized I screwed up. And it wasn't 30 and then 32 names. It actually ends at 29. Right? Which becomes an 18, which is 3 sixes. Yes. Oh my God. So, starting here with Sir William V, right, we get a long line back all the way to that number 29 spot at the very end. All right, and so that leaves 13 names to go until we reach the end of the list, right? And the amazing thing about it is 11 of them, which would actually be 12 of 14, including him, are all knights. Every single one. You know, we have the 4 here, of course, right? But they're all knights all the way down, right, to the end. And I'm not going to go to the end just yet because I want to talk about this, right? After a certain point, they put the date of birth for all of these knights as estimated before 1271. Now, it's interesting that we have Sir William Disney III, right? Birth date 1272. His father was born sometime after 1274. I'm not exactly sure quite how that works, but that's the way Genie wants us to think of it. So they're all knights. 12 of 14, starting with the 5th, are knights all the way to the end, and it ends with one Lambert Disney. And so now I wanted to figure out how far back is this, because so many of these knights, almost all of them really, wait a minute. The last 12 names on the list, the only date of birth it gives is before 1271, but that's thousands of years. And so what I did was I created an average of issue for 30 years, all right, and dated it all back. You know, and just roughly comes out to about 350 years. So 350 years from when Sir William Disney would have been a knight, that puts it back right to the Norman invasion. And that Lambert came over with William the Conqueror, and he was granted Lincolnshire right after the Norman invasion. And that the Disney family served as knights to the crown for 350 years. All right, so not only is that the entire time of those earliest Norman kings, right, it is the entire time the House of Plantagenet sits on the throne. The Disney family are knights to the House Plantagenet the whole time. All right, the family held the English throne from 1154 until 1485. All right, they are knights of the House Plantagenet. All right, under the Plantagenets, England was transformed, right? Although this was only partly intentional. Partly. They had a plan. The Plantagenet kings were often forced to negotiate compromises such as the Magna Carta. These constrained royal power in return for financial and military support. The king was no longer just the most powerful man in the nation, holding the prerogative of judgment, feudal tribute, and warfare. He now had defined duties to the realm, underpinned by a sophisticated justice system. So it's here, under the Plantagenets, that the concept of the freedom of choice is presented. That we actually have a say in our government and the things that go on. The illusion of choice is presented to us through this Magna Carta, right? In their fancy words on their paper. Right? So now it's amazing that this is the Disney family traces its roots back to this, but not only that, and I don't have it brought up, but King John, here, who I think was 3rd of the Plantagenet kings, son to Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, I believe he was. And now I think that's interesting that Disney's grandmother was a Richard's son, as was King John here. Right? There is a story somewhere in my Poe research where that Poe's relatives fought alongside King John, and that he rewarded them as well. So tentatively, I can connect the Poes to King John here, and I can definitely connect the Disneys to King John, because they were knights this whole time, right? And so Jeanette is a colony of plants, fungi, or bacteria that come from a single genetic source. And I think it's interesting that the root word of genetics, or gene, is in Jeanette, and Plantagenet, right? But a Jeanette is also a small predatory old world carnivore related to the civet. And I didn't look the civet up, but I did look up what the Jeanettes were, right? And it's interesting that they're kind of like these leopardy, like they're this leopard-fox hybrid. And it's interesting that on the Calvert coat of arms are leopards or spotted cats. And so perhaps maybe this could tie that in with the Plantagenets, and Jeanettes being these big cats. Again, now my mind is just absolutely blown by the fact that Walt Disney's family is this, noble family of knights for generations, 350 some years, with other knights in there and sheriffs and so forth. And, where they're knights out of and the families that they could be connected to, it's unbelievable. And so the place where the Disney family gets its name is this here. It's Isny-sur-Mer, right? And its coat of arms is this. I think it's interesting, right? We have a chevron, but we have a bull, we have anchors, and we have, I don't know if that's the papal, if that's the hat of the Pope or just a cardinal's hat, but definitely, a Catholic bishop's hat. But some interesting symbology on their crest, all right, especially when you look into what Isny-sur-Mer was. And I think it's interesting, hearing it that way, it makes me think of Sumer, right? Because Isny-sur-Mer is on fertile grassland, right? The estuary of 4 rivers. We know how important all that is, right? But this is the best part. The town is famous for its butter and cream, but for its fancy cheeses. And so I think it's amazing that the name Disney is synonymous with cheese. That is just unbelievable. All right, the Disney family traces back to before the Norman conquest of England, and William the Conqueror had military commanders named Disney. All right, and we talked a little bit about that, tracing the knights back to those dates. All right, and the name Isny is said to derive from fire of Isis, the Greco-Egyptian goddess who was once worshipped in the area, or alternatively, from the submerged lost city of Is. It's said to be nearby. And so both of these origins for the name Disney are amazing to me, right? But we have to start somewhere. So we're going to start with the submerged lost city of Is. And I thought, this is one I'd never heard of. I thought I was pretty well versed in these lost cities and civilizations. I guess not so much. Okay, and so Is, right, or Caris in Breton and Vildis in French. And I like Caris the best, right? It was a mythical city on the coast of Brittany that was swallowed by the ocean. All right, and so in that original Breton, Caris means low city. All right, and so the legend of Is is as follows, right? There's this King Gradian, and he built a city on land reclaimed from the sea. And I like that imagery there, right? It's described as rich in commerce and the arts, with his palace being made of marble, cedar, and gold. In some versions, Gradian builds the city upon the request of his daughter, Dahut, who loved the sea. All right, and to protect the city from inundation, and there's that word again, so familiar after the Baltimore floods, a dike was built with a gate that was opened for ships during low tide. The one key that operated the gate was held by the king. All right, but a little further digging reveals that this King Gradian was king of Cornwall, which is really amazing, right? Right, so legend is that his daughter Dahut falls in love with a charming young stranger who came to the island and was persuaded by him to steal the keys from her father. But the stranger, who was actually the devil, right, opened the city dam, allowing the ocean to flood the island and destroy it. Right, but Gradian manages to escape by reaching the coast on his fairy steed Morvac, right, a gift from the ancient Celts, right, the Tuatha De Danann. When the devil opens the gates, a saint woke the king and urged him to flee, and he mounted his horse and took his daughter with him. Right, so as the water was about to overtake him, a voice calls out, "Throw the demon thou carriest into the sea, if thou dost not desire to perish." Right, and Dahut fell from the horse's back, and Gradian was saved. Right, so did he sacrifice his daughter? Right, or did she fall off? Did she sacrifice herself? But a voice cries out, calling her a demon. Right, and in some versions, when Dahut falls into the ocean, she becomes a Morgan or a mermaid. And I think this is interesting because I never considered Morgan Le Fay or Morgana Le Fay a mermaid. And it also makes me wonder if Hans Christian Andersen knew this story, with Disney making The Little Mermaid later on as well. This story allegedly takes place in the Bronze Age, about 1200 BC. And he compares this legend to the last vestiges of Atlantis and the Elysian Fields. Could Disney's family actually be connected to Atlantis? And now I can add Atlantis as another box to check on Poe's list, of all the things that are being connected through him. It's unbelievable. This is Brittany here, right? So it would have been an island off the coast of Brittany. And again, this is a peninsula, and the peninsula playing such an important role because the Cornwall Peninsula is here. And so he would have been a king of an island somewhere in between here. And Disney Sumer is associated with this legend. Right? And so not only that, this legend was developed when? Right, between the end of the 15th century, so the latter half of the 1400s, and the 17th century, and the 1600s. That same stretch of time that the Disneys and the Byrons and the Poes were inhabiting that Sherwood Forest, Papelwick, Lincolnshire area. And so while this legend develops then off of older sources, of course, right, as well as the Robin Hood legend develops around this time from older sources, of course. But that's just the half of it, right? Because Isni is also associated with the fire of Isis. And here she is. She's a major goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, of course, right? Right, wife of Osiris, resurrecting him from the dead after his murder. And during the Hellenistic period, her worship was spread throughout, continental Europe and even into England, because the Hellenistic culture was absorbed by Rome, right? And we certainly know that Rome was all over northeastern Europe and in England by the 1st century BCE, right? And so it's certainly realistic to think that Isni in Brittany would have been, or could have been, a center for the worship of Isis, right? And because we should remember that Isis' reputed magical power was greater than that of all other gods. She was said to protect the kingdom of its enemies, govern the skies and the natural world, and have power over fate itself. She was a sky goddess controlling the sun and the moon and the floods, which are sometimes equated with the tears that she shed for Osiris after his murder and dismemberment. And she's a universal goddess as well. Her sphere of influence includes the entire cosmos. All right, she protected Egypt, endorsed its kings. She had power over all the nations. She was the provider of rain. Right? She enlivened the natural world. And she's at her most fiery, remember, Isni, fire of Isis, is when she's the avenging goddess. Right? And she had the ability to create and destroy life with mere words. She not only knew the words, which needed to be spoken to cause certain things to occur, but was also able to use exact pronunciation and emphasis in order for the desired effect to occur. It is believed that if the best effect was to be produced by words of power, they must be uttered in a certain tone of voice, and at a certain rate, and at a certain time of the day or night, with appropriate gestures or ceremonies. Only when these conditions have been met can true magic occur. And this is why I talked about Steamboat Willie and that being one of the very first sound cartoons and his whistling there. He's whistling a tune, right? And Isis, if Disney's name comes from the fire of Isis and that a ritual worship of Isis in Brittany, right? And he understood that Isis could control things with sound and what the power of language and melody could be. And Disney knew the sound of that talkies was the way of the future, right? And so I thought that was an interesting connection. And there were 2 great festivals dedicated to Isis. The first was the vernal equinox to celebrate the return of life to the world, which was around March 20th. Now again, I have to wonder if with adjusted calendars and so forth, if this could be March 13th and the Ides of March. So many things seem to be happening on the Ides of March these days. Right? But this paled to the second celebration, which was Halloween, All Hallows Eve, right? And lasted through November 3rd. Samhain. And the thing about her, too, is that she's a mother goddess. And the thing about these mother goddesses is that they were all over these cultures and that they all are really just sort of the same goddess. And so this is Asherah, right? Look at her. She's not a worm or anything, right? And she was consort to Baal and El before him, right? In these Mesopotamian and Canaanite early religions. She was the all-mother, right? And bringing it back even further to Çatalhöyük, right? And the seated woman of Çatalhöyük. It was part of James Millard, who was the main archaeologist at Çatalhöyük, that Çatalhöyük was this center for mother goddess worship, and that there she is. This is Big Mama, the mother goddess. Right? And what are mother goddesses? They're hungry too, right? They need to be fed, right? Sacrifices need to be made in order for these goddesses to perform the functions that they need to function. Bring the rain, the sun, and whatever else, the fertile grasslands, right? And there's no greater demonstration of how these mother goddesses travel along in that Isis and, the seated woman of Chetalhoyuk and Asherah and all these, they're in the New World as well, right? And the Aztecs had one, the mother of the gods, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the name Coatlicue, right, is Nahuatl for the one with the skirt of serpents, right? Right? She's referred to as the mother goddess of the earth who gives birth to all celestial things, the goddess of fire and fertility, the goddess of life, death, and rebirth. She was the mother of the gods and the grandmother of the race of man, right? And the statue allegedly depicts her in her most gruesome form, right? Her most gruesome form, because she's a flesh-eating goddess of sacrifice, right? 2 serpent heads sprang from her severed neck to form the single face of the great earth monster. A necklace of human hearts and hands decorate her body, a form comprised entirely of serpents. The earth goddess is represented as the cannibalistic eater of flesh, right? Serpents coming up from her severed head. Human hearts and hands in here, I guess. It's absolutely gruesome. And so I think it's these Aztec interpretations of these elder gods that really provide us a clue as to what some of this worship could still really be about. And that they took great efforts to erase that aspect of just how gruesome Greco-Roman ritual practices could have been, and bringing that back to the Mesopotamian and so forth with human sacrifice and that kind of thing, right? That's really amazing, because Izny itself was more than 60% destroyed by bombardment during World War II, conveniently wiping out. I'm sure none of that was targeted. They didn't take out sites that needed to be gotten rid of or anything. And so now, as if all of this hasn't been amazing enough with Disney and Atlantis and Isis, this story gets even better, right? Because going along and tracking back the history of Walt Disney here. All right, so now we have Disney's father here, Elias, which means son of Yahweh, right? And his mother was Flora. And again, I really think that's interesting now that we know that the Disneys connect to the Plantagenets the way that they do. Plant, Flora. All right, so now when I was doing my clicking back, there was a name that I hadn't talked about yet. I don't think it's a coincidence that clicking back the way that I did, that this was name number 6 on the list, right? And it's Mechadosek Disney. I was like, Mechadosek? And his birthday they have listed as 1660. And so I just needed to find out what Mechasodek meant, right? It's definitely sounded biblical, right? All right, and so it's the angelicized Melchizedek, right? It's an old Canaanite name meaning my king is the god Sedek. My king is righteousness. And Melchizedek here was the king of Salem, which was most probably Jerusalem. And so it's supposed that this Zedek was worshipped in pre-Israelite Jerusalem as the name of 2 kings of the city, Melchizedek and Adonizedek, contain the element Zedek. And that Zedek was an epithet of the god El. Right? But of course, the mainstream understanding of these names, my king is righteousness and my lord is righteousness, is that they refer to the concept of righteousness and not to an actual physical god. Right? Of course, that's the mainstream modern understanding of these things, right? That's what we've been being conditioned to believe for the last hundreds of years, right? Zedek is El, here he is, king of the gods. And so now if Zedek is El, Melchizedek just means high priest of El. But in other traditions, Melchizedek, right, it's presented as a nickname title for Shem, the son of Noah. And not only that, according to the epistle to the Hebrews, Jesus Christ is identified as high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And so now Disney's 6th great-grandfather has the name Melchizedek, which means high priest of El, and also is a nickname for Shem, who was one of Noah's sons. And so among the children of Shem is listed this one Arphaxad. That's how I'm going to pronounce that. And Arphaxad is the patriarch to Abraham. Abraham, of course, being the founder of all the Semitic religions, right? Right? And that Shem was 100 years old when he gave birth to Arphaxad. Right? 2 years after the flood. Right? And that he lived for another 500 years. And so now, according to Flavius Josephus, remember this guy? He's the guy that A.P. Arnold was going to give a lecture about at the Young Men Hebrews Club. In that ad right next to the little blurb about Poe's remains not being in the right place. Well, he talks about Melchizedek being the king of Jerusalem, whom Abraham is recorded to have met. So Abraham would have actually met his great-great-great-great grandfather, Shem, who is this Melchizedek. Right? And Melchizedek high priest of El. And now, unfortunately, I did not get to go into the Book of Jubilees when I was making my Jubilee videos, and hopefully someday I'll get back there. But the wife of Shem is one Seta Kettle Abab. Seta Kettle Abab. And so now, according to the Sibylline oracles, right, the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who were Noah's children, enjoyed fantastically long lifespans, living for centuries, while speaking prophecy to each generation that saw them come and go. Right? And that the author of these Sibylline oracles was a daughter-in-law of Noah, perhaps even Shem's wife, the Babylonian Sibyl. And now when you look at the names of the daughter-in-laws of Noah, the only one that even comes close to Sibyl, right? And that 900 years after the deluge, she moves to Greece and began writing these oracles. And that these writings hint at the possible names of her family, who would have lived before the flood. Her father Nostos, or her mother Circe. And now Circe is one of those earliest mother goddesses we were talking about. And who elsewhere is called Isis. Disney's name comes from the fire of Isis, Isni. Right? His great-grandfather, 6 times removed, or however many, his name is Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the high priest of El, who may also be Shem, right? Who would be this oracle's husband, right? That is unbelievable, right? And even more unbelievable, tying all of this into the Mud City Paradigm puzzle tree, is that all of this goes back to the very first episode I ever did, my test episode, about the American brewery building and King Gambrinus, who was married to Isis, who was also a relative of Noah. And now I don't have that brought up, but that is absolutely the story of Gambrinus. Unbelievable the way this thing is tying all together. All right, so now we're going to close this one out here with just a closer look at Melchizedek here as being a high priest of El and what else that could mean. But of course, they need us to know that El is a generic word for any god, right? It doesn't necessarily have to mean the god, even though El is listed as the head of many pantheons. Many. In the Canaanite and Ugaritic sources, El is the father of the gods and of creation, right? Big Kahuna, El. Zeus, Jupiter, however else you want to name him. Or Baal, right? And what do we know about these Canaanite earliest religions of the Levant and the Mesopotamian world? And it's that they offer up burnt offerings of children, right? And that Baal is just another name for Moloch. And Moloch is the biblical name of the Canaanite god associated with child sacrifice. And that Sir Edmund Thomas Bewley wrote a family history of the family Moloch, along with the family Poe, right? And tying Disney's name to the worship of Isis, who traces her roots all the way back to these earliest Canaanite religions, and Isis being Asherah, human sacrifice demands made upon that, right? And that there are 800,000 children that go missing in America each year. And when you see the symbology hidden, the numerology hidden in the Disney name with the 3 6s, this has just been an absolutely crazy story to pull together. Remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lie. All right, and so until the next one, cheers, guys.